The first time I saw the human, I did not see a soldier. I saw an insult. I am Vask Dracorn, third hatched of the Corn broodline, blooded at 11 cycles in the long hunger trials of my mother's nest, holder of 2 molt scars earned in honest combat before I had even finished growing into my adult teeth. Among my own kind, the scan status is not given. It is taken in claw and blood and breath, from the moment a hatchling first cracks its shell and fights its siblings for the warmest patch of the nesting sand. We do not believe in soft things. We do not believe in mercy, except as something you earn the right to extend once you have proven you could have withheld it. Strength is truth. Everything else is decoration. So when the transport doors on Keshdoral hissed open, and I watched a column of new cadets file out onto the black glass tarmac of Ashvin Academy, I was already sorting them the way any scan sorts a room, by muscle mass, by stance, by the set of the jaw, by how much weight a body could take before it broke. The Vantrii cadets moved like water, all coiled grace, and I respected that, the way you respect a blade even if it isn't yours. The Offren came off the ramp already snarling at each other over rank, and I respected that too. In a lesser way, competition is at least honest. Then the humans came off the ship. There is no delicate way to say what I felt, so I will simply say it. Contempt. Not hatred. Hatred requires you to believe something is a threat, and I did not believe that, not yet, not for one heartbeat. What I felt was the lazy, comfortable superiority of a nest champion watching hatchlings totter across warm sand. They were soft-skinned, unarmored, unscaled, unclawed. Their bodies were built wrong, all pale meat and thin bone, no natural weapon anywhere on them except perhaps their 2 clever hands, which even a Vantrii pup could break in one grip. They walked upright on legs that seemed built more for standing in queues than for crossing broken ground. Among my brood we have a phrase, soft skin, and I had heard it said as a joke my whole life, an old insult flung at any species without scale or shell. I had never really believed it, the way you don't really believe old jokes. That day, watching them, I believed it completely. And out of that column of pale, soft, unimpressive creatures stepped the one who would become, against every instinct I had and every lesson my nest had ever taught me, the person I trusted most in the galaxy. Her name was Elena Reyes. I did not know that yet. What I knew in that first moment was only a rank patch cadet, provisional Terran Expeditionary Corps, and a face that gave away nothing at all. She did not gawk at the black volcanic spires ringing the academy grounds the way the other new arrivals did. She did not flinch at the sulfur wind, though I saw her nostrils flare once, cataloging it, filing it away as information rather than discomfort. She looked at the training yards, at the obstacle towers, at the dual rings where senior cadets were already sparring in the morning heat, and her expression did something I did not have a word for yet. It would take me many months to learn that word. The word was assessment. She was not afraid. She was taking notes. I decided, in the space of 3 heartbeats, that she was beneath my notice, and I decided this so completely that I spent the next several months making absolutely certain she knew it. We were assigned to the same training cohort, Talon Squad, 11 species, 30 cadets, all funneled toward the same brutal curriculum that the Coalition uses to determine who is fit to hold a command rank and who is fit only to follow one. I was cohort sergeant, a position I had fought 3 duels to earn, and I ran that yard like a nest champion runs her territory, loudly, physically, and with absolute confidence that no one under my authority could outperform me in anything that mattered. Reyes proved, almost immediately, to be extremely good at making me doubt that confidence, which I resented far more than I resented her mere existence. It began with small things. The obstacle course that broke 2 Offren cadets' ankles in the first week. She finished it clean, not fastest, but clean, every single time, with a kind of grinding, patient efficiency that had nothing showy in it at all. The endurance runs across the ash flats, where the thin, sulphurous air of Keshdoral put half the off-world cadets on their knees gasping within the first kilometer. She paced herself like she'd read a manual on it, which, I would later learn she had, because that is a thing humans do that took me a very long time to understand the value of. They do not merely train, they study. I told myself none of it mattered. Endurance is not strength. Cleverness is not courage. A soft thing that survives by care and calculation is still a soft thing, I told myself, still built wrong, still beneath a warrior who could R it in half with one proper strike. And because I believed this so thoroughly, and because pride left unchallenged only grows fatter, I found a way to prove it. The duel ring at Ashvane is not decorative. It is where rank disputes are settled, where cohort sergeants demonstrate their fitness to lead, where, if I am honest, and I am trying very hard in the telling of this story to be honest, even about the parts of myself I am least proud of where I liked, very much, to remind everyone exactly what a scanned body could do to lesser bodies when given permission. I challenged her in the third week. I do not remember my exact justification. I believe I told myself it was a training exercise, a demonstration for the newer cadets on cross-species combat calibration, something noble-sounding and official. What it actually was, underneath the justification, was this. She had beaten my personal best time on the Ash Flat run by 4 seconds 2 days earlier, quietly, without comment, without so much as looking at me when she crossed the line, and something in my chest had curdled at the sight of it, and I wanted, very badly, to put her back in what I considered her proper place. She said yes. She did not hesitate, did not posture, did not try to talk her way out of it the way some cadets did when facing a scan in the ring for the first time. She simply said, "All right," in that flat, unbothered Terran way and began stretching, and I remember feeling beneath the satisfaction a small, unwelcome flicker of respect for the fact that she did not seem afraid. I want to describe that fight honestly, because it is the first crack in the wall, even though I did not let myself see it as a crack at the time. I outweighed her by perhaps 60 kilos. I had reach on her, claws on her, a hide that could shrug off blows that would shatter human bone. By every measure my culture had ever taught me to respect, that fight should have lasted 4 seconds. It lasted almost 3 minutes, and for most of those 3 minutes, I was the one being made to look foolish in front of my own cohort. She did not try to match my strength. She was not stupid, whatever else I believed about her at the time. She moved like water finding the cracks in stone, using my own momentum against me, redirecting a charge that would have ended most cadets into a fall that put me on my back in front of 30 watching recruits. She had studied scan anatomy. I learned this later, that she had spent 3 nights in the archive terminal reading combat logs on species physiology before we ever stepped in the ring, that she had noted the stiff hinge of a scant knee joint, and the blind spot created by our lateral eye placement, that she had, in short, prepared for me the way a soldier prepares for an enemy, while I had prepared for her the way a bully prepares for an easy target. I did win in the end. My strength advantage was real, and eventually I got a grip on her and the fight was, by any technical measure, mine. But I ended that match bleeding from a cut above my brow ridge that I would carry the scar of for the rest of my life, breathing hard in a way I had not breathed hard in a coalition ring in over a year, and staring down at a human cadet who looked up at me from the dust with no fear in her eyes at all, only the calm, assessing look of someone updating a mental file. "Good match," she said, and got up without help, and walked off the mat holding her ribs at an angle that told me at least one of them was cracked, and did not so much as glance back at me for sympathy or acknowledgement. I told my cohort loudly that the outcome proved exactly what I had always believed. I told myself the same thing that night, alone, pressing a cold compress to the cut over my eye. I told myself many things. None of them were quite true, and some small, buried part of me already knew it. The rivalry did not end there. If anything, it sharpened, because now I had a mark on my face that every cadet in the yard could see, and pride does not react well to visible evidence of its own limits. I found reasons to critique her in front of others. I made a point of correcting her form during drills even when her form did not need correcting. I called her soft-skinned to her face more than once, hoping, if I am honest, for some flicker of hurt or anger that would let me feel, once again, like the larger creature in the room. She never gave me that flicker. Instead, she did something worse from the perspective of my pride. She got better. Every week, some new gap closed. Her ash-flat times dropped further. Her marksmanship scores, mediocre at first, climbed until she was outscoring cadets who had trained with rifles since childhood. She began, without ever once seeking my approval, to earn the quiet respect of the rest of Talon's squad, cadet by cadet, not through any grand gesture but through the accumulated weight of simply, consistently, showing up and doing the difficult thing without complaint. I watched this happen and called it stubbornness. I watched this happen and refused, for a long time, to call it anything else. It was Instructor Marshal Thren who gave voice to what I would not admit I was thinking, and in doing so set the whole shape of the story that followed. Thren was old even by scan measure, a first claw of 3 generations back, decorated in a dozen border conflicts before most of us in that cohort had hatched, and she ran the Academy's advanced curriculum with the absolute, unquestioned authority of someone who had never once in her long life been told no and made to live with it. She did not like humans. She did not hide this. She considered the Coalition's decision to admit them to officer training a political indulgence rather than a military judgment. And she said so, in briefings, in front of us, in the particular dry, contemptuous tone that older scan use when they believe the young are wasting their potential on unworthy company. The occasion was the announcement of the Ashfall Crucible. Every third-year cohort at Ashvin faces it before commissioning, a solo endurance trial up the black slopes of Mount Colgrim, the dead volcano whose ash fields give the Academy its name, through terrain that has broken cadets from a dozen species over the decades the trial has existed. Thin air near the summit. Temperature swings violent enough to kill an unprepared body twice over in a single day. Blistering heat in the ash basins by noon and killing cold on the exposed ridgelines by dusk. Loose scree that could take a leg out from under you without warning. It is not merely a fitness test. It is a character test, deliberately built to strip away every advantage except the ones that matter: judgment, endurance, the will to keep moving when moving seems impossible. Thren stood before the assembled cohort in the briefing hall, the mountain's holographic profile glowing behind her, and read out the record times of every species that had ever completed the crucible. And when she reached the end of that list, she paused and looked, deliberately, I thought, toward the small cluster of human cadets seated near the back. No human has ever completed this trial, she said. I want to be plain with you because I think plainness is a kindness the Coalition too rarely extends to your species. Your physiology was not built for this mountain. Your lungs are too shallow, your recovery too slow, your bodies too poorly insulated against thermal swing. I do not say this to discourage you from attempting it, because the regulations require every cadet to attempt it. I say this so that when you fail, and you will fail, you understand it is not a failure of will. It is simply a fact of what you are. No human can survive the crucible. I remember the room's silence afterward, and I remember, with some shame now, that I felt a small, ugly satisfaction hearing it, because it confirmed the story I had been telling myself since the transport doors first opened on the tarmac. I looked over at Ray's to see how the words had landed, expecting anger or fear, or the beginning of the kind of quiet despair I had seen in weaker cadets facing that mountain's reputation. She was writing something down. Notes, I realized later, on wind patterns and elevation gain, because while Thren had been delivering her verdict on the limits of human biology, Ray's had apparently decided the more useful use of her time was planning a route. I did not understand then what I was looking at. I understand it now, and it still humbles me to think of it. that in the exact moment I most wanted to believe her inferior, she was already 3 steps ahead of me in preparing to prove otherwise, and doing it so quietly that only her own certainty seemed to notice. The cohort was paired for the ascent, not for shared completion, since the Crucible is a solo trial in every sense that matters for scoring, but paired for launch order and emergency tracking. 2 cadets sent up different flanks of the same slope at staggered intervals, so that rescue beacons could triangulate faster if something went wrong. When the pairing roster went up on the board outside the briefing hall, I scanned it with the mild, habitual interest of someone checking a schedule, and then I saw my own name beside hers, and something in my chest did a strange, complicated thing that I did not, at the time, have the honesty to name as anything other than irritation. I told myself it was simply bad luck. I told myself, standing in front of that board with my tail lashing in a way that any scan would have recognized as agitation, that I would treat it as nothing more than an administrative inconvenience, that I would launch, ascend, finish, and be done with the entire arrangement before the ash-flat winds even had time to strip the moisture from my scales. I remember almost nothing of my own launch that morning except the party. Particular quality of the light, a sick orange glow through the perpetual haze of Keshdoral's upper atmosphere, the mountain looming black and indifferent above the training grounds like something that had been waiting a very long time for someone foolish enough to climb it. I remember checking my gear 3 times out of nervous habit disguised as diligence. I remember seeing Rays at the staging line on the human flank of the launch pad, adjusting the straps of a pack that looked absurdly small next to my own reinforced climbing harness. And I remember thinking, with the last untroubled certainty I would carry for a long time afterward, that I would be standing at the summit marker for at least 2 hours before her name ever registered on the beacon board. I was wrong about almost everything that happened on that mountain, but I want to be honest and say that in the beginning, at least, I was not wrong about the pace. I moved fast. Scan muscle is built for exactly this kind of punishing vertical effort, dense-backed and oxygen-efficient in a way that lets us push hard through terrain that would stagger a weaker body. And I climbed the black scree slopes of Colgrim's lower flank with the kind of controlled, showy speed that comes from wanting, somewhere in the animal part of the brain, to be seen doing it well even when no one is watching. By midday, I had crossed the first checkpoint nearly 40 minutes ahead of my personal projection, and I allowed myself, briefly, the small, ugly pleasure of imagining Rays struggling somewhere below on the human flank of the mountain, gasping in air too thin for lungs Thren had already declared inadequate, perhaps already turning back, perhaps already becoming exactly the failure the instructor marshal had promised she would be. It is difficult now to explain how thoroughly the mountain punished that particular piece of arrogance, except to say that Colgrim does not care what species you belong to, and it does not negotiate with pride. The ashquake came without warning in the early afternoon, the kind of geological shudder that Keshdoral's dormant volcanic system produces perhaps once a season, usually mild enough to pass unnoticed by anyone not standing directly on unstable ground. I was not so fortunate. I was crossing a scree traverse on the mountain's exposed eastern face when the slope beneath me simply gave way, the whole loose black shelf of ash and broken stone sliding downward in a roaring, choking wave that took me with it for what felt, in the moment, like considerably longer than the 11 seconds my suit's chronometer later told me it actually was. I remember the impact that ended the slide, a boulder, half buried, that my body struck at an angle that drove the air from my lungs and something sharper and worse through the joint of my right leg. I remember the specific, silencing horror of reaching for my breathing mask afterward and finding it cracked, the seal broken, the thin acidic air of the upper ash fields already beginning to sting the soft membranes of my throat with every labored breath. I remember, with a clarity that has not faded in all the time since, the precise moment I understood that I was going to die on that mountain, alone, buried under a collapsed slope in air my body could not process. Because my leg would not hold weight, and my mask would not hold seal, and the nearest checkpoint beacon was kilometers away across terrain I no longer had any ability to cross. I did not call for help. I want to be honest about that too, because it is not a flattering thing to admit. My pride, even in that moment, even facing what I genuinely believed was the end of my life, resisted the idea of transmitting a distress signal that every cadet on that mountain would hear, resisted the image of being found broken and gasping by anyone, and most of all resisted, with an intensity that shames me even now, the possibility of being found that way by her. The beacon activated anyway. It was automated, tied to a fall detection sensor in my harness that I had not thought to disable, and it began broadcasting my position and vitals to the emergency channel the moment the slide stopped, whether my pride consented to it or not. I do not know how long I lay there before I heard footsteps on the loose scree above me, a scraping, careful, deliberate sound, someone picking a controlled path down an unstable slope, rather than rushing it and triggering a second collapse. I remember, through the graying edges of my vision, seeing her crest the ridge above the slide zone, packed still on her back, and I remember the specific, humiliating flare of anger I felt at being seen like that, broken and gasping, by the one person in the entire cohort I had spent months insisting was beneath my concern. "Don't," I managed to say when she reached me, though I do not fully know what I meant by it. "Don't help me. Don't see this. Don't let this be the story that gets told." She did not answer that. She did something far more infuriating, which was to ignore it entirely and begin working the problem in front of her with the same flat, methodical calm she brought to everything, checking my leg, checking my mask seal, checking the slope above us for signs of further instability, all with an economy of motion that told me, even through the haze of oxygen deprivation and pain, that this was not her first time doing something like this. That somewhere in her training or her past, or simply in the particular way humans are built to face crisis, she had prepared for exactly this kind of moment and was not going to waste time being frightened by it now that it had arrived. "Your record time," I said or tried to say, the words coming out thick and slurred through a throat already burning from bad air. "You will lose it. Stopping here, you will lose the time you have already earned. Go, finish the trial. This is not," I could not finish the sentence. I am not certain even now how I intended to finish it. She looked at me then for just a moment, with an expression I did not understand at the time and have thought about often since. Something that was not quite pity, because pity would have been easier for my pride to dismiss, but something closer to simple, unhurried certainty, the look of someone who had already made a decision and did not consider it worth debating. "I know," she said, and then she cracked open the emergency seal on her own mask, the spare filter cartridge I had not even known human climbing gear carried, and fitted over the cracked seam of mine, sacrificing her own margin of safety in that thin, acid air to buy time for a body that was not hers and a species that, until that morning, had never once treated her with anything resembling respect. I do not have adequate words even now for what it did to something fundamental in me, watching her make that choice without hesitation, without negotiation, without any of the calculating self-interest my culture had taught me was simply the honest shape of survival. I had spent months insisting she was soft. I had spent months insisting that whatever strength she had did not count, because it did not look like my strength, did not come wrapped in scale and claw and the loud, visible confidence of a nest champion. And in the moment that actually mattered, not the duel ring, not the ash-flat sprint, not any of the arenas where I had chosen to measure her, she simply gave away the resource that might have saved her own life, to save mine, and did it so quickly and so completely that it was clear she had never for one moment considered doing anything else. She splinted my leg with the collapsible frame from her own pack, tearing the straps of her climbing harness to bind it, working with hands that I noticed, distantly, through the fog of pain, were shaking slightly from exertion and cold even as her voice stayed level and unhurried. She got me upright. She got my arm across her shoulders, absorbing a portion of my weight that her own frame had no business being able to carry, and she began, step by careful step, moving us both toward the nearest stable ground, talking the entire time, not comfort exactly, not the soft reassurances I might have expected, but a steady, practical narration of terrain and footing and distance remaining. The voice of someone keeping a wounded person's mind occupied and oriented rather than letting it slide toward panic or despair. Why? I finally managed to ask her, somewhere in that long, agonizing traverse, my pride finally cracking enough to let the real question through. I called you soft-skin. I fought you in the ring to embarrass you. I have said nothing kind to you since the day you arrived. Why would you do this? She was quiet for a moment, picking her way around a loose boulder before she answered, and when she did, her voice held none of the anger I had, on some level, expected and perhaps even deserved. Because you needed help, she said simply, and I was there to give it. What you called me doesn't change what's true. I did not understand at that moment how completely that sentence would come to reorganize everything I believed about strength. We did not reach the summit that day in any way that either of us had planned to. We reached, instead, an emergency way station 2 kilometers below the ridge, a reinforced shelter built into the mountain's flank for exactly this kind of contingency. And it was there that the rescue beacon finally brought a retrieval team to carry me the rest of the way down while Reyes, having spent hours of the trial's precious clock keeping a rival alive instead of climbing toward her own glory, sat beside me on the shelter's cold floor, exhausted, undramatic, apparently untroubled by what the decision had likely cost her. I want to be honest about what I felt in that shelter because it was not immediate transformation. It was not some clean, sudden conversion from prejudice to respect, however much a cleaner story might prefer that shape. What I felt mostly, in that cold, uncomfortable hour of waiting, was shame. A slow, grinding, deeply unwelcome shame that sat in my chest like a stone and would not be dislodged by any of the old justifications I tried to reach for. I had spent months telling myself a story about what she was, and that story had just been proven, in the plainest terms possible, to be a lie I had constructed entirely for my own comfort. You should not have stopped, I said finally, because it was easier to say than the truth, which was that I did not know how to thank someone for a gift that large without admitting how badly I had misjudged them. Probably not career-wise, she agreed, without any bitterness in it at all. But I wasn't going to leave you on that ridge, Vask. That's not a hard call. I don't know why you think it should be. That, I think, more than anything else on that mountain, was the moment the wall in me truly began to come down, not the rescue itself, remarkable as it was, but the sheer, unbothered simplicity with which she treated an act of extraordinary selflessness as though it were the most obvious, unremarkable thing in the world. My whole culture had taught me that mercy was a resource, carefully rationed, extended only to those who had proven themselves worthy of it through strength already demonstrated. She had extended it to someone who had spent months actively working to demean her, without a flicker of hesitation, and she genuinely did not seem to understand why I found that difficult to comprehend. I was carried down the mountain that evening, my ascent officially terminated, my trial marked incomplete, a small, quiet failure that stung far less than it should have, buried as it was under the much larger reckoning taking place inside me. Reyes descended separately, on her own power, having long since forfeited any chance at the record pace she had clearly been building toward before the ashquake tore both our plans apart. What I did not know, sitting in the medical bay that night with my leg in a regeneration brace and my pride in considerably worse condition, was that the story was not finished. It was, in fact, only beginning its final and most important movement, and the next test would not take place on any mountain at all. It would take place in a hearing room, in front of my own kind, and it would ask something of me far more difficult than surviving an ashquake had ever asked. Word travels fast in a place like Ashvin, and by the time I was cleared to leave the medical bay 2 days later, the story of the Crucible attempt had already taken on a shape I did not like at all. It had been reported, accurately in its facts, but badly in its framing, that the human cadet Reyes had abandoned her ascent to render aid to an injured scan cadet, and that in doing so she had forfeited any possibility of completing the trial within the academic term, likely delaying her commissioning by an entire cycle. I heard this version from 3 different cadets before I even reached the mess hall, and each time it was told with a particular tone I recognized instantly, because I had used that tone myself, not so long ago, about her. Weakness, the tone implied, poor judgment, a soft creature making a soft, self-defeating choice exactly as expected. I found her in the mess hall that evening, sitting alone at the end of a long table, eating with the same unhurried efficiency she brought to everything, apparently unbothered by the whispers moving through the room around her, and I sat down across from her without being invited, which was, for a scan, already an unusual concession. "They are saying you were foolish," I told her, because I did not yet know how to say what I actually meant. "I've heard," she said, not looking up from her tray. "You could have left me. The regulations do not require a cadet to render aid at the cost of their own trial completion. Any of them would tell you this. I would have told you this myself before." I stopped, because the sentence had nowhere honest to go except toward an admission I was still not fully ready to make out loud. She looked up at me then, and there was something almost amused in her expression, though not unkind. "Vask," she said, "I didn't stop to think about the regulations. I stopped because you would have died. That's the whole equation. I don't need it to be more complicated than that, and I don't really care what anyone in this hall thinks it says about me." I did not have a response to that. I sat with her in silence for a while, which was, I would come to understand, its own kind of apology and its own kind of beginning. The real test came a week later, when Instructor Marshal Thren convened what the Academy calls a standing review, a formal hearing held whenever a trial outcome is contested or unusual enough to require official examination. And the Ashfall Crucible incident, involving as it did a human cadet's decision to abandon a historic potential first completion in favor of rescuing a scan rival, qualified easily. I was called to testify, as the cadet who had been rescued, and I understood, walking into that hearing room with its high black stone walls and its panel of senior instructors seated in judgment, that I was about to be asked to choose between 2 versions of myself, and that whichever one I gave voice to would matter far more than anything I had ever done in a duel ring. Thren opened the proceedings with the particular cold formality she reserved for matters she considered a waste of institutional time. "Cadet Vask," she said, "you are aware that Cadet Reyes' decision to interrupt her ascent has significant implications for her standing in this cohort. Some among the instructor staff have raised the question of whether her judgment under pressure, choosing sentiment over mission completion, reflects poorly on her fitness for command rank. You were the party she rendered aid to. I would like your assessment, as the officer she abandoned her trial to save, of whether that decision constituted sound judgment or a failure of it." I could feel in that moment the full weight of what my nest, my brood, my entire species' understanding of strength would have wanted me to say. I could feel the shape of the easy answer, that a warrior's duty is to the mission, that mercy extended at the cost of glory is mercy poorly spent, that a true scan would have understood the calculation and made the harder, colder choice, and that Reyes' failure to do so, whatever its emotional appeal, was in fact exactly the kind of softness Thren had predicted from the beginning. I had believed that answer myself 3 weeks earlier. I might have given it without hesitation, might have used it to reclaim some of the pride I had lost lying broken on that ridge, might have found in it a way to distance myself from the discomfort of having needed saving at all. I did not give that answer. "Instructor Marshall," I said, and I made myself hold her gaze while I said it because I understood that flinching from it would be its own kind of dishonesty. I would not be alive to testify at all if Cadet Reyes had made the choice you are describing as sound judgment. I was buried in a slide with a cracked breathing seal and a shattered leg on terrain I could not have crossed on my own. She did not merely offer comfort. She gave up her own emergency filter, in air that was actively damaging her, to keep my seal functioning long enough to move me to safety. She built a splint from her own equipment. She carried a portion of my weight across 2 kilometers of unstable ground while her own reserves were already compromised from the air exposure. And she did all of this knowing, explicitly, that it would cost her the completion she had trained an entire cycle to earn. I paused, and the hearing room was very quiet, and I made myself continue. "You told our cohort at the announcement of this trial that no human could survive the crucible. I want to say, formally, for the record, that you were wrong, and that the way you were wrong is the part that matters most. Cadet Reyes did not fail to survive the crucible because her body was inadequate to it. She chose to interrupt her own survival, her own success, in order to preserve someone else's. Among my own people, we have always called that kind of choice the highest form of strength. There is the willingness to spend something you cannot get back for the sake of another. We simply never expected to see a human make that choice, and so when she made it, some of us called it weakness instead, because it was easier than admitting we had misjudged her from the beginning. I misjudged her from the beginning. I'm not ashamed to say that in this room, because the alternative is pretending I did not, and I did." There was a silence after that which I still remember with a kind of startled clarity. The particular silence of a room full of senior officers who had expected one answer and received an entirely different one, and did not yet know what to do with the gap between them. Thren's expression did not change much. Scan elders are trained from long before we are to control the visible weather of their faces. But I saw something move behind her eyes, not agreement, not yet, but the first small crack of reconsideration, the look of someone forced to hold a belief up to new light and finding, to their own visible discomfort, that it no longer fit quite as cleanly as it once had. "You believe her actions reflect fitness for command, then," Thren said, "rather than a failure of it." "I believe," I said, "that a commander who will not sacrifice her own glory to save the life of someone under her care is not a commander I would ever wish to serve beside. I believe Cadet Reyes demonstrated exactly the judgment this decade. My claims to be training us toward, and that the only reason it is being questioned in this room is that it came wrapped in a species we did not expect it from. I would ask the panel to consider whether that expectation says more about her or about us. I do not know, fully, where the courage for that final sentence came from. I had spent my entire life inside a culture that measured worth in claw marks and dual scars and the loud, visible confidence of nest champions, and I stood in that hearing room and told the most decorated instructor at the academy, to her face, that her judgment of an entire species had been wrong, and I did it not because I had stopped caring what my own kind thought of me, but because I had finally understood that some things mattered more than that. The panel deliberated for 3 days. When the ruling came, it restored Reyes' standing fully, credited her partial assent toward eventual retrial rather than marking it a failure, and in language I suspect Thren herself resisted including, though I never confirmed this, formally noted that her conduct on Mount Colgrim represented, in the panel's assessment, an exemplary demonstration of the judgment expected of a coalition officer. She was granted a retrial slot for the following season, and this time I asked formally, through the proper channels, with none of my earlier pride left to protect, to be paired with her again, not for rescue this time, but simply because I found, somewhat to my own surprise, that I wanted to be there when she finished what that mountain had interrupted, and because some quiet, Reorganized part of me understood that I would learn more standing beside her on that climb than I had learned in 3 cycles of dual rings and ash-flat sprints combined. The second attempt, when it came, was almost anticlimactic in its cleanness, though I mean that as the highest compliment I know how to give. There was no ashquake, no collapse, no crisis requiring either of us to prove anything further to the other. We had already proven what needed proving on that first broken attempt in the only arena that had ever actually mattered. She climbed with the same flat, patient efficiency I had first mistaken for weakness and had come, by then, to recognize as something closer to mastery. Never wasting motion, never wasting breath, reading the mountain the way I had once foolishly assumed only claw and scale could read it, until the black slopes of Colgrim simply ran out beneath her boots, and the summit marker stood in front of her, and the trial clock stopped. It stopped at just under 9 hours. The previous record, my own species record, held for 2 generations by a Scan cadet whose name is still carved into the summit stone, stood at just over 19. She had not merely completed the crucible. She had cut the standing record for any species, on any prior attempt, by more than half, and she had done it on a second try, on a body that Instructor Marshal Thren had once declared, in front of the entire cohort, biologically incapable of surviving the attempt at all. I was waiting for her at the summit marker when she reached it, having climbed the flank myself that same morning, not to race her this time, only to be present for it. And when she crested that final ridge and saw me standing there, she did the thing that, more than the record time, more than the hearing room, more than anything else in that long, strange, transformative season, finally and completely undid whatever remained of the wall I had spent so long building against her. She smiled, a small, tired, genuinely warm thing, and said, "Took you long enough to get here first for once." I laughed. I do not laugh easily. Scan humor tends toward the dry and the pointed, not the open kind, but something about the absurdity of it. The two of us standing on a mountain that had once nearly killed me, and had once been declared impossible for her, trading the same tired banter we might have traded across a mess hall table, broke something loose in my chest that had been tight since the day the transport doors first opened on the tarmac, and I had looked at her and seen nothing but an insult. "I have something to say to you," I told her, once the summit officials had finished recording the beacon confirmation, and the small crowd of instructors and cadets that had gathered to witness the record had begun to disperse, leaving the two of us alone at the marker with the wind moving low and cold across the black stone. "It is not easy for me to say it, so I would ask you to let me finish before you respond." She sat down on the summit stone, unhurried as ever, and gestured for me to continue. And I found, standing there, that the words I had been rehearsing in my head for weeks were harder to produce out loud than I had expected. "I called you soft-skin the first week I knew you," I said. "I told myself it meant nothing, that it was simply an old word, an old joke, but I know now that I meant it as a judgment, and that the judgment was wrong from the very first day I made it. I decided what you were before I had ever seen what you could do, because it was easier for my pride to believe you were beneath me than to consider that strength might look like something other than what my own nest had taught me to recognize. You gave me your own air on that mountain, when I had given you nothing but contempt in return, and you did it without asking whether I had earned it, because you understood something about strength that it took me nearly dying to begin to understand myself, that the truest kind of it is not what you can take from others. It is what you are willing to give up for them, when giving costs you something real." I stopped, and the wind moved between us, and she waited, patient, the way she always waited, letting me find the rest of it on my own. "I am sorry," I said finally, and I do not think I had ever said those particular words to anyone outside my own nest, not once in my entire life. "For the ring, for the mess hall, for every day I spent deciding you were less than me before I had ever given you the chance to show me otherwise. You were never the one who needed to survive that mountain to prove something. I was the one who needed it, though I did not know that until I was lying broken on it, watching you choose to save someone who had given you every reason not to." She was quiet for a long moment, looking out at the ash field spread out gold and orange below the summit in the fading light, and when she finally spoke, her voice had none of the flatness I had grown so used to, only something softer, something that told me she had been carrying her own version of this conversation for longer than I had realized. "I know why you said the things you said, Vask," she told me. "I've known since about the second week. You weren't the only one who decided what I was before they'd seen what I could do. Half this academy did the same thing, and honestly, so did I a little about all of you at the start. I was scared of failing here. I was scared of proving Thren right. And I think some part of me picked you, specifically, to be angry at, because you made it easy, you were loud about it, where everyone else was just quiet and polite and doubtful in ways that were harder to fight. So don't apologize like you're the only one who had something to learn up here. We both did." "Perhaps," I said, "but I think only one of us nearly died for it, and only one of us gave away her own heir to save the other regardless." "That's not a competition, Vask," she said, and there was real warmth in it now, the first time I had heard that particular warmth directed at me without qualification. "I didn't do it to win anything. I did it because that's what you do for someone you—" She stopped, and I watched her search briefly for the right word, the way I had searched for mine a few moments earlier. "For someone you have come to care for," I offered quietly, "even if you did not yet know at the time that you had come to care for them." She looked at me and something eased in her expression, some last small distance finally closing. "Yeah," she said, "that." We sat together on the summit stone as the last of the daylight drained out of the sky over Keshdoril, the black spires of the mountain range turning first orange and then a deep, cooling violet, and neither of us said very much for a while, because there was, by then, no longer very much that needed saying. I thought of the tarmac, months earlier, of the pale, soft column of humans stepping off the transport ramp, and the swift, ugly certainty with which I had sorted them into a category built entirely out of my own pride. I thought of the champion I had believed myself to be that day, so certain of my own strength that I had never once thought to ask what strength might look like in a shape I did not recognize. I had been wrong about almost everything I believed on that first day. I understood now, sitting on a mountain that a human had just conquered in half the time any scan ever had, that the strength I had spent my whole life measuring in claw marks and dual scars was only ever one small dialect in a much larger language, and that I had very nearly gone my entire life without learning to hear the rest of it. "You know," I said finally, as the first stars began to show through the thinning ash haze above us, "when I first saw you step off that transport, I decided, before you had said a single word to me, that you were the least impressive cadet in the entire cohort." She laughed, a short, genuine sound, tired and easy. "I remember. You made that pretty clear for about 3 months straight." "I was wrong," I said, "about nearly everything I believed that day. But I think I was most wrong about this. I thought strength was the thing I already understood. I did not yet know it could be a thing I still had to learn to see." She reached over without any particular ceremony and set her hand briefly against my shoulder, the human gesture I had come, by then, to understand as something closer to a scant clasp of kinship than the small, casual thing it looked like from the outside. "For what it's worth," she said, "I'm glad you finally saw it. Took you long enough, champion." "Yes," I agreed, and found, to my own quiet astonishment, that I did not mind the old title at all anymore coming from her. It did. I am glad I did not run out of mountain before I managed it.